Hi everybody. Today we're going to be discussing the bones of the skull, and I'm going to be working off of this list, which is your lab practical list. The bones that you are required to be able to identify are on this list, listed in bold. We also have markings on some of the bones. A marking is just an area of interest on that bone. It's sort of an anatomical landmark. And a marking could be a hole in the bone, or it could be like a little piece that's sticking out, or maybe a little indentation in the bone. If a bone has a marking that you need to know, it will be indented slightly under that bone. So you can see here the temporal bone is listed, and there's actually two markings on it. However, the maxilla, you are responsible for the maxilla, but you don't have any other markings that you need to know on that bone. So I'm going to be working off of this list, but I'm not going to be going exactly in the right order of this list. Okay, so let's start at the front of the skull. So this bone here is the frontal bone. This would be the bone that's right underneath your forehead. So we call that the frontal bone, and it's the front of the skull. The bone that makes up the front of the face is right here. You can see that there are some yellow lines that indicate where bones have fused together. So this bone that we're talking about, the front of the face, is called the maxilla, and the maxilla ends right about here on either side. Next to the maxilla, making up sort of the outer part of the face, are two bones. These are called the zygomatic bones. There's one on either side, and that's pretty much making up your cheekbone. Now the zygomatic bone has a marking on it. It's called the zygomatic arch. If you look down at the skull kind of from the top, you can see that this bone arches out away from the rest of the skull. That's going to make that nice cheekbone there. So that's the zygomatic arch right here, this whole sort of thin part. If you keep going back along the zygomatic arch, you run into a bone called the temporal bone. These are the edges of the temporal bone here. And normally this would be where your ear is. So if you put your hand over your ear right now, you're actually having your hand over the temporal bone. And there's one on each side. This is the left side, and there's one on the other side of the skull. The temporal bone has two markings associated with it. One of them is called the external auditory meatus. And a meatus is like a channel in a bone. And if I put my pencil in here, you can see that there is indeed a channel going through this bone. So that is the external auditory meatus, and that is where your ear canal goes and tunnels through into the inside of the temporal bone. The other marking that's on the temporal bone is this one right here, this little bump. This is called the mastoid process. The mastoid process is very rough looking and rough feeling because there's a lot of muscles that attach there. So this is the maxilla, the front of the face, and this lower jaw is called the mandible. The mandible is the only movable bone on the skull. The mandible has a couple of markings that are associated with it. This right here is called the mandibular notch. We also have something called the mental foramen, and that's this hole right here. You have one on each side. The reason it's called the mental foramen is because the chin region of the skull is known as the mental region. If you look inside the jaw, so as if you were opening up somebody's jaw and looking deep back, there's a hole back here. That's called the mandibular foramen. Both the mental foramen and the mandibular foramen are holes that allow blood vessels and nerves to come through the bone. Okay, so I have my skull back together. Now we've already talked about the maxilla, but there's a couple of other bones of interest right here around the nose. The two bones that make up the bridge of the nose here are called the nasal bones, one on each side. If you look in the eye socket, you can see, light's not great, but you can see there's a little sort of canal, a hole in there. The bone that hole is in is called the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal glands produce tears, and there's a canal that's going to drain those tears from the eyeball in the lacrimal bone. The bone that's at the front of the forehead starts down here at the superior side of the eye sockets and goes back. That's the frontal bone. And on either side of the skull, behind the frontal bone, you have a parietal bone. So you have two parietal bones. And the very back of the skull is made up of the occipital bone. If I turn the skull upside down, so we're now looking at it upside down, you can see that the occipital bone is very large, and it actually contains this very, very big hole. This hole is where the spinal cord leaves the skull, and the hole is called the foramen magnum. Foramen means hole and magnum means large, so this is a very large hole. On either side of the hole is a smooth, rounded area. This is where the skull articulates or moves against the first cervical vertebrae, and these are called occipital condyles. The jugular foramen is another marking on the occipital bone. Here's the occipital bone, here's the foramen magnum. If you kind of turn the skull slightly, you can see there's holes on the bottom here, right there. That's the jugular foramen. Those are where the jugular veins leave the skull and come back to the heart. All right, I'm going to take the top of the cranium off here so that you can see inside. I'm going to turn it around. Remember, this is the front of the face, so we're sort of looking at it from the superior aspect and the posterior side. You can see the foramen magnum and the occipital bone. Up at the front here is the frontal bone, and on the sides are the temporal bones. There's another bone in here that makes up the sort of the middle of the face, and it kind of looks like a bat. You see, here's the bat wings. That's called the sphenoid bone. And the sphenoid bone has a couple of things that you need to know what they are. The first one is called the sella turcica, and it's this structure right here. In front of the sella turcica is a little fossa, and that's where the pituitary gland would sit. If you poke your pencil forward through those two holes, you would come out in the eye socket. So these are the optic canals. The optic nerves come from the eyes through those into the brain. The last marking on the sphenoid bone is the carotid canal. And the carotid canals are two holes that are through the skull that provide passageway for the carotid arteries to bring oxygenated blood to the brain. So here's the sella turcica, and on either side is going to be a large hole, and just lateral to that, you can actually see on my skull here, it's dark. So just lateral to the big hole is a smaller hole called the carotid canal. You have one on either side which correlate to the left and the right carotid arteries. We have one more bone to discuss on this aspect of the skull, and that's the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is very hard to see because it makes up the inside and back part of the face, but you can see a little bit of it here. If you follow the yellow line, that is an outline of the piece of ethmoid bone that sticks up into and through the frontal bone. So if this is the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone kind of sticks up like that through it. And this part that's sticking up is called the crista galli. It's kind of like a rooster tail that's sticking up and out into this cavity made by the brain case. The other marking of the ethmoid bone that you need to know are the olfactory foramina. Olfactory means smell or nose, and foramina is a really, really tiny hole. So foramen is a hole, a foramina is a very small hole. You can kind of see on this skull that there are little dots in there, and those are meant to represent the olfactory foramina. This is where the nerves from the nasal cavity come up and carry any information about what you're smelling up through here and are going to eventually form the olfactory nerve. The ethmoid bone can also be seen a little bit on the anterior side of the face. If you look in the eye socket, this is the maxilla, and then here would be one of the lacrimal bones, and just behind it is the ethmoid bone. And you can see that on each side. So here's the lacrimal bone, and just behind it is the ethmoid bone. You can also see it if you look up the nose. The top of the nasal cavity here is the ethmoid bone, and actually those olfactory foramina would be little holes that are going from here through the ethmoid bone and coming out up here in the brain case. We have a couple more bones on the front of the face that we have to go through. The vomer is the bone that makes up this partition on the inferior part of the nose. So this right here is the vomer. We also have something called the palatine bones. If you turn the skull over and imagine that you're looking at the roof of your mouth. So here are the teeth, here's the roof of your mouth, and the very posterior portion of the hard palate, you could probably even put your tongue up to the roof of your mouth all the way back just before it starts turning soft. Those are the palatine bones. There's two of them on each side, and they are fused together, and they have pieces that reach up to help connect the back of the maxilla to the underside of all these other bones. One thing that we haven't covered yet are the sutures of the skull. And sutures are joints between two bones. They are immovable joints. They're not like your fingers joints, which move. They actually don't have any movement between them. But we have 4 different sutures on the skull. The first one you can see right here. This is a joint or a suture between the frontal bone and the parietal bones. This is called the coronal suture, and it follows the coronal plane of the body. So if you remember, the coronal plane separates the front from the back of the body. The coronal suture separates the front from the back of the skull. Between the 2 parietal bones, we have something called the sagittal suture. And again, it follows the sagittal plane of the body. Sagittal plane of the body, as a review, separates the left from the right half of the body, and the sagittal suture of the skull separates the left parietal bone from the right parietal bone. At the back of the skull, between the parietal bones and the occipital bone, we have another suture called the lambdoid suture. This separates the occipital bone at the back of the skull from the left and the right parietal bones. We also have a suture that's on the side of the skull, and you can kind of see that right here. And remember, this is the temporal bone, this is the parietal bone, and this suture is called the squamous suture, and it separates those 2 bones. So you're going to have a squamous suture on one side and a squamous suture on the other side. So again, 4 sutures: coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, and squamous. And with that, we're done with the bones and markings of the skull. See you in class.